Good evening. Welcome to the debut of my weekly talk radio show, Employment Law Today. I'm Eric Sarver, an employment law business law attorney and founder of the law firm, The Law Offices of Eric M. Sarver. And my firm specializes in employment law, labor law, and business law for small to mid-sized business owners, companies, and professionals in all areas of various industries. And so I had the inspiration to create this weekly radio show to talk about some of the issues that business owners are facing today, particularly around COVID-19 and the pandemic, and how that affects you as a business owner in terms of new employment laws that need to be followed, various regulations around the workplace, and how you go about hiring and firing, furloughing, and all kinds of other aspects of your business in the modern world. And so with that in mind, I'd like to take a moment to say that this show, Employment Law Today, will be on Tuesday nights from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on talkradio.nyc. We'll be live streaming on Facebook as well. And I thought since it's the debut and premiere of the show, I'd take a moment before introducing my first guest ever, and I would talk a little bit about the three main goals of Employment Law Today. So the first goal of the show is really an informational one. We want to provide information, updates to you, the viewer and listener, on what's going on with employment law these days. What are some new laws and challenges that you as a business owner might be facing when it comes to COVID-19 in the workplace? And then the second aspect of the show, the second goal, what I hope to accomplish, is an inspirational one, which is really involves having guests on my show who can provide resources, people in HR, people in accounting or tax, legal, like myself, or CFOs, and folks that can basically assist you, the business owner, in knowing what you need to do to comply with today's complex business workplace. And lastly, I hope the show will be a source of inspiration and motivation. And so I'll be featuring guest business owners on the show who have managed to be successful, to survive and even thrive during the pandemic. And many of them got there by taking help from others and taking advice and feedback from people who are trained at areas of employment law. And so with those goals in mind, and with today's show entitled Leading Your Employees During the Pandemic, Mindsets and Methods for a Successful Workforce, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Taryn Abrahams to the show. I'll give a little bit of a background, but first I want to say, Taryn, welcome to the show and thank you for being our very first guest.
Thank you so much, Eric. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, to be a part of your kickoff. I have nothing but confidence that you're going to do good work. You're going to provide valuable insights, and I'm just so grateful to be your first guest. Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Well, that's the goal, of course, and really happy to have you on the show as a guest. And I'll say a little bit about you, Taryn, just if I can sing your praise for a moment. Great. I've known Taryn for a bit, and I'll say that Taryn Abrahams is a workplace strategist and a corporate behavioral specialist and an employee engagement specialist. And Taryn, and you'll find out what that means today when you hear Taryn speak about the issues we'll be discussing. And Taryn founded a business called Empower Behavioral Services. It's been around since, I believe, early 2016. And it's a full-service consulting and training company that helps businesses to strengthen interpersonal connections and relations, employer-employee morale, boosting productivity, having those hard discussions with employees on the work site. And that's Taryn's focus. And I'll read a little bit of Taryn's bio if I can, if I may. Great. Taryn Abrahams is a corporate behavioral and human interaction expert who helps companies to implement behavioral best practices to improve workplace interpersonal relations. I think I may have just said that, but I'll reinforce it. And to holistically strengthen the corporate culture. She leverages her experience as a psychotherapist, and she has an innovative suite of workshops and trainings, as well as coaching and collaborative services that help workplaces to thrive and to nurture employee loyalty and ambassadorship. Does that sound about right, Taryn?
That hits it right on the head. Thank you.
Okay,
seriously, that's great.
Wonderful. So why don't we kick it off then and begin tonight's show. As I mentioned when we were speaking, that I want to touch upon the issues that business owners are facing these days. And I should say not only around COVID-19, because some employment labor issues are showing themselves these days, even independent of the pandemic. But it seems to me that the pandemic and the closing and reopening has created a real need for clarity around employer-employee issues. And the two issues that struck me perhaps are really worth speaking about tonight would be, number one, employees who refuse to come back to work. Right? What do? You're the business owner, the employer, or you're the manager of a company, and you've got some employees who just refuse to come back. And in that group, you'll find maybe three categories. You'll find employees who don't want to come back, and they'll cite the specific concerns about the workplace, maybe being dangerous, not COVID-19 safe or friendly or unhealthy, or they might complain that it's an unsafe workplace and that their employer, you the employer, are not doing enough to assist them. The second group of employees in this category might be folks who their issue with coming back has nothing to do with your workplace, but it's an internal issue. It maybe has to do with they have a pre-existing condition or a health concern, or they have a small child at home, or a disabled family member that's stuck at home with them and they need to take care of them. So then the third category of employees who might refuse to come in might be the ones that are just citing some more vague, generic concerns. So it's not so much, hey boss, I've got bronchitis and I'm in a pre-existing condition class, or it's not a question of, hey boss, I've heard rumors of the water cooler that you're not having masks. It's, I just don't really like what I'm seeing and this makes me very nervous and I don't want to come in. And the second issue, which we'll get to, would be kind of related. What do you do as an employer to create and maintain a safe and healthy workplace with a healthy workplace culture during COVID-19, right? How do you make sure that employees are following the rules and how do you enforce those rules without employees starting to feel resentful? And how do you address maybe issues, let's say, of employees who have different levels of sensitivity to this pandemic and are taking it in different levels of seriousness? What's your job and role as an employer to be the enforcer, right? How do you lead? So it's really about leadership and the mindset and methods.
I mean, let's start off by saying that, I think there's no playbook to anything that we're going through right now. What I'm going to provide today is really my insight based on my experience as a professional and what I have noticed to be effective in the leadership space. But by no means, I think we're all sort of feeling our way through this as we go through this together. And I think it's the first thing I really kind of want to preface is, even though we're all in this together, we're all going through our own unique experiences. So when you talk about leadership, I think what really separates good leaders from exceptional leaders are exceptional leaders take the time to understand each individual employee's situation. And that really goes back to empathy. It's not just about showing your concern about their output as an employee, but showing your concern for their overall well-being. And we all respond to stress differently, okay? Now, some of us are ready to go back to work, and as long as we see certain precautions taken, we're ready to go. Then there's others that may not have a pre-existing condition, but may suffer from chronic anxiety or hypochondriasis, and they battle already with concerns about their emotional well-being and their medical status. So, so it really is about taking the time to get to know each employee. And I know that is a tall order because we're all overstretched. We're all inundated. We're all trying to figure out ways to cope and pivot. I know that's a word we hear a lot of lately, but it's true. But I think if we are looking to really retain employees, and I don't just mean retain bodies, I mean keep them engaged, I mean keep them loyal, then you have to take an extra step as a leader to show that care and concern and to work with them and to create almost a plan of action for each individual employee because everybody's situation is totally different. Recently, actually, a CBS news poll was done, and it said that only 44% of people are comfortable going back to work physically. So that means more than half, are not comfortable. So what that means is we need to not only figure out ways to create safety physically in terms of hand washing, in terms of wearing masks, but what are leaders going to do to make sure that they're creating environments that are emotionally supportive? And I think that really kind of sometimes, that's a challenge for leaders, because we're having conversations and we're thinking about things we maybe have never really thought were relevant in the workplace. But a good leader recognizes that it's about their entire wellness. It's not just a matter of, are they well enough to show up at work physically, but what can we do to support them emotionally? And I think that you will find that the companies that can figure out that secret sauce are the ones that are going to sustain their business through this pandemic.
It's a really good point, Taryn. A lot of good points in there about getting to know the individual needs of the employees, right? Not assuming that all employees are cookie cutter, have one particular approach to COVID-19. And I think a good manager, a good employer also, as you were saying, would recognize that even, let's say, if that employer's attitude is, okay, I've been going crazy at home, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and jump right in. Other employees might have a whole different approach, right? They want to keep the tone.
Right. And it means listening with compassion, because if you are a leader that maybe doesn't believe in the virus or thinks the virus is going to disappear after the election or whatever your personal belief might be, we need to, as leaders, make sure that we don't project what we feel in our own experience onto the employees that we manage. Because I have news for you, our employees see right through leaders that are not authentic. And so you can still disagree on certain things with that employee, but still show empathy and support. So I just wanted to kind of throw it in. This isn't about everybody agreeing. Right. It's about how can you show that connection and that compassion? Because at the end of the day, I think that's what all employees are looking for. How much do you care about me?
I guess that goes to the issue, right, of what kind of mindset and attitude a leader should have effectively. You touched upon some very important points there, because, right, there's often been this, I've had clients over the years, as I mentioned, I practice employment law, and so I have business owners, and some look at what the law requires in terms of what's the minimum that I have to do to not get sued by employees, right, to not get fined by the Department of Labor, and just in case we keep employees coming back. And others ask, what is the minimum, but also what can I do, right? What are some of the norms? What are some practical tips that people use? And I often will point out to my clients that, look, even let's say, for example, in New York City and New York State, if you're a business, let's say Manhattan, you might not be required to give a certain amount of days vacation time by the law. You may only be required to give 5 paid sick days under New York City paid sick leave law. There's the minimum, but then, so you're compliant, you're not breaking the law, but you're not really motivating your employees. And if your employees are resentful and disgruntled, from your point of view, what I hear is that they're not as productive and the morale goes down. And from my point of view as an employment lawyer, what I hear is that, a disgruntled employee, unhappy employee, if they find a violation of sorts in the law or regulation, some might seek to exploit that. Others might quit under very harsh circumstances, and you might be faced with a potential lawsuit. So really, I hear a lot about the benefits of getting to know your employees, listening. And speaking of listening, I know we're up for a break in about a minute, but I just want to really give some credence to what you're saying. I found it to be true, and I find that we might approach our clients with slightly different ways. I'm trying to keep them from getting sued. I'm trying to make sure they follow the law, but you're also trying to make sure that they don't self-destruct by creating such discord in the workplace and dividing. And I love what you said about keeping views, personal views, out of the.
I think that's a big piece to this, very big. It's not a matter of agreeing. We don't have to all agree to support each other.
And that's, in these modern times, I think it's so hard to find.
Very hard to find.
Yes.
Yes,
So, we
I know.
have a commercial break coming up now, but When we come back, we'll have more of Taryn Abrahams. So everyone please stick around.
You're listening to the Talking Alternative Network.
Do you run or are ready to open your own business? Hi, I'm Jeremiah Fox. I've been operating and opening small business for the last 25 years, and I'm the host of the new show, The Entrepreneurial Web. Tune in every Friday at noon Eastern Time for insights and stories on the nuances of running small business right here on Fridays at noon, talkradio.nyc.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Talking Alternative Radio, 24 hours a day.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm here with, again, Taryn Abrahams, founder of Empower Behavioral Services, full service consulting and training company for corporate culture, employer-employee relations. And if you're just joining us, we're talking about two common issues that businesses are facing today with COVID-19 in the workplace. One of them is when you've got employees who refuse to come into work, citing to their concerns around the virus. And the other issue, which we'll get to in a little bit, has to do with how an employer can go about creating and really fostering a work culture, an environment at work that encourages compliance with COVID-19 safety regulations, that de-escalates conflicts between different workers, employees and employers. And so I'm joined by Taryn Abrahams. Taryn, just before the break, some great points there. Well, and I think you really answered a question I was going to ask you about with respect to the mindset of a good leader. And I heard those words that we hear a lot, and I think it's important. I think that the training guide, like you said, there's no handbook for dealing with what we're dealing with today. Yeah. It's just a whole other, crazy world, the way things changed from March. And sure. I just find that the old school sort of method that I know a lot of people followed for a long time of being very strict with your employees, it has its drawbacks, both from an attorney legal perspective of what might happen, but also from an employee morale. And it just, on the break, for some reason, I got this thought in my head of a really funny scene from the movie Office Space with Ron Livingston and other really funny folks in that. And I think it was great. It was when Ron's character is being interviewed by the two Bobs, the two HR consultants who are in no way qualified as you are, and they're doing their job. And they ask him about what he's doing, and he's talking about how he has 8 different managers droning on, 8 bosses breathing down his neck, and he says something it's kind of funny, but it's very true. He said, and that will only get me to do the bare minimum I need to do to show up and not get fired. And it was all taken in a funny context, right?
No,
but I think it's just.
But it's a great example, because to me, the worst type of employee is the one that shows up and is just going through the motions. They're not bringing their A game. they're not putting their, their best foot forward. They don't bring passion. They don't bring innovation.
Mhm.
And like what you're talking about is, we've got traditional leadership, which years ago we thought you treat everybody the same, and you strict leadership. But we're starting to realize now that there's an interpersonal responsibility, a big interpersonal piece to leadership. In fact, emotional intelligence is the buzzword of the year, I think, because leaders that have the ability to emotionally connect with their employees are the ones that can bring the best out in their employees. And I think as we navigate through this pandemic, leadership needs to remember, first of all, we're still in the thick of it. I mean, I know we've been going through this for 6-7 months now, but we look back at this 10 years from now, we're still in it. We're still very much in this. We've acclimated, we've been resilient in certain ways, we've been able to pivot, but we're still in the middle of this, and we're approaching the fall, which numbers could go up, and so we need to remember as leaders that employees have been traumatized. Some of the employees have been extremely traumatized, and significantly burdened by COVID. Now, whether they've lost a loved one, whether their spouse or partner lost their job and they're now supporting the whole family, there are so many wounds that need to heal. And I think leaders that know how to connect with their employees, I think that ultimately, if that's an employee that's afraid to come into the workplace physically, if you continue to show that care and support, you will be able to move them to a place where they will be eventually comfortable to come in, because you've shown that care. If you are an employee that meets resistance with resistance, why aren't you coming in? Most of the people are back in the office. You're worrying about nothing. I can guarantee you that if that person comes back, they're certainly not going to come back whole and ready to give 110%, because they have lost the respect in you as a leader. And I think respect and trust, I think that's the foundation of every relationship on this planet, but especially the relationship between a leader and employee. I think it's really critical, especially now.
I tend to agree so much. And, it's interesting because once again, right, you're talking about ways to move employees towards coming back if they're citing to certain concerns. And I like to remind my clients, right, the business owner, that, hey, you know what, you might be able to move, right, convince some employees to come back, especially the ones who maybe they're not citing any specific concerns like about your workplace, right? They're not saying, look, boss, I've been, listening to people talk about how no one's wearing their masks or people are not social distancing, and the employees maybe, let's say, who are not citing to their own health concerns and not saying, look, I have asthma, I have COPD, and that might put you in a whole other category, right? Because then maybe it's time not to so much push, even gently, maybe then it's time to talk about, well, what's a reasonable accommodation request? Is the person or with the medical document, right? And will that create undue hardship to grant it? And, I think often employers, if they're leading with compassion though, and they're not meeting their employee with a sense of fight, like I must force them, I must push this, I must make.
Or placing judgment, placing judgment. And, there's many ways to send a message. Something maybe even an inappropriate joke. You don't mean any harm by it, but it can plant a seed in that employee's mind of like, this person is judging me, because I'm not comfortable coming back into the workplace. So, I just think, we need to be really mindful of those little cues and those little messages that we send out. And for those employees that are struggling to come back, they can still be a part of the initiative of bringing people back. You can create committees where they can be a part of creating safe spaces. They can still be part of the solution, even remotely. And I think listen, if there's any lesson we've learned from this pandemic, I think there's been many lessons. The biggest lesson for me is that you can still get your stuff done remotely. In fact, there's been studies that show that productivity is actually up with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, because they have given their employees the ability to create flexible workspaces where they can still manage their personal life and they still manage their professional life. And we know that people still get the work done, and effectively too. So I think we also have to redefine what success looks like.
Yes, that
Right.
I must agree with you on that, right? What does success look like? I think too often
Right.
for business owners and for employers, they look at success in terms of metrics or the outcome. So they think to themselves, I am successful if, right, let's say I have 10 employees, 7 come back, 2 don't come back, but they cite to, let's say, disability. So, okay, maybe they have to get an accommodation to work from home. But let's say if you're, a restaurant or a barbershop, it might be a little harder to grant that you can't be maybe a waiter from home. But
Right.
maybe there's some kind of like staggered shift they can do, coming on off hours. But there are some things you can do. But in terms of redefining successful outcomes, I couldn't agree more. I think that, these days, the success in my mind is in the employer, the business owner, right, developing a healthy methodology of dealing with and addressing their employees, right? So it's if they're improving communication, if they're improving like listening and also asking questions, if they're documenting the outcomes, and if they're having team building exercises, or they're encouraging people to speak openly, then even if you maybe lose a couple of employees who don't want to come back, and maybe they don't have a health condition, and maybe they don't have a specific complaint about the workplace, and maybe it will be time to let them go. But if you've shown, and this is from an attorney's point of view, an employment lawyer's point of view, I see it as the less that the employee feels that they've been ignored, disrespected, disregarded, or discarded, the less likely they are, like say, to try to file a lawsuit, to seek some kind of extra damages against you. And so in some ways, by doing the right thing, from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, you're actually decreasing your chance of being sued, and you might even be increasing productivity. So even if you're, say, a manager, you think to yourself, well, all this emotional intelligence and all this, compassion, it's, all these modern people, like it's all XYZ, fill in the blank, whatever adjective. I think what I hear you saying is it's important for an effective leader, if that's their attitude, to step back, right? Step away from that attitude and really try to, right, reserve and suspend judgment, right? Watch out for those desired to have those snappy comments and retorts, which, by the way, as an employment lawyer, I could say, degrading comments, if done pervasively and persistently, and if you throw in a racial or a gender stereotype into the mix, you can be looking at some real liability issues there. And while that may sound like, hey, why am I talking about liability only? I should say I truly do want to see my employers and my clients, that is, client employers, survive and thrive. And so I try to mix into my advice, look out for the bottom line, worst case scenario, but also let's build something positive. And that's why, when I draft employee handbooks and policies, I really try to encourage policies that will keep an open line of communication, and I document things. And I think I hear you talking about maybe some of that as well, in terms of something I think maybe we can address after the break, and maybe we can even connect this to the second issue of how we are creating and fostering a healthy COVID-19 compliant workplace. And that's the issue of, right, like what are some specific methods? Like maybe we can even, let's say, go through the scenario of maybe an employee who, let's say, just for the sake of argument, right, is home and they're not, maybe after the break we can perhaps address this. How might you encourage an employer to respond? Employee is, say, 35, has no known health risks, doesn't name any health risks, doesn't name any issues in the workplace, but just doesn't want to come back to work because of COVID-19, wants to stay home and get paid, but let's say they can't work remotely, right? It's their restaurant or bakery, it's a barbershop. So I wonder, like, if you could maybe, since some listeners might be in that category of owners and they're wondering what to do, would you be comfortable maybe sharing some tips you might give to them in that scenario?
Absolutely. I see we're approaching a break, so maybe we can table that for after the break.
My thoughts exactly. Exactly right. So after the break, we'll do that, and then we'll talk about the next issue of right, creating that healthy workplace. And you got the employees coming in. Well, now what? Right? How do you keep them engaged and motivated, and how do you deal with different employees' levels of respect for or lack of compliance with COVID-19 regulations? So Taryn, this is really great. I knew you'd be a great first guest. You're very, just the way you describe things so authentically, and the way you articulate your points. It's really
Thank you.
welcome, pleasure. I should say that for the end, right? Thank you, but I'll just say it.
You were yet.
I'll say it again. Yes, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. It really is.
Thank you. I'm happy to be
Welcome.
here.
So we're not ending yet, folks. Don't stick around. We'll be right back in a
Please
moment.
don't go anywhere.
Yes, right. Grab some popcorn or a snack, but we'll be back in just a moment.
You're listening to the Talking Alternative Network at www.talkingalternative.com. Now, broadcasting 24 hours a day. Talking Alternative.
Do you run or are ready to open your own business? Hi, I'm Jeremiah Fox. I've been operating and opening small business for the last 25 years, and I'm the host of the new show, The Entrepreneurial Web. Tune in every Friday at noon Eastern Time for insights and stories on the nuances of running small business right here on Fridays at noon, talkradio.nyc.
Do you love or are you intrigued about New York City and its neighborhoods? I'm Jeff Goodman, host of Rediscovering New York, a weekly show that showcases New York's history and its extraordinary neighborhoods. Every Tuesday live at 7 p.m., we focus on a particular neighborhood and explore its history, its vibe, its feel, and its energy. Tune in live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Hi, I'm Graham Dobbin. Join me every Thursday evening for the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. We speak to people from business, sport, military, and politics, all around what makes a great leader. The personal experiences of what's worked and, maybe more importantly, what hasn't worked. So that's 7 o'clock every Thursday evening, the Mind Behind Leadership here on talkradio.nyc. Listen to real stories of real leaders.
Talking Alternative Radio, 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to the show. Taryn, on the break, you mentioned wanting to perhaps lead with a point about redefining success, and I want to just give you the space to do that before we talk about that hypothetical scenario.
Yes, and I wanted to go back to this point because I think understanding this is really going to set the framework for how we lead our employees. Success may have been in the past sitting at your desk or your cubicle for 8 hours and working for 8 hours. That might have been how you defined a successful day for your employee. But I think we as leaders, we need to redefine what that success looks like. Because if we decide to lead the same way and we lead with the same expectations, that absolutely can lead to micromanaging, abrasive leadership, the feeling of wanting to control because maybe you sense a feeling of out of control because people are working remotely and you can't check on them. You can't check up on them anymore. You can't walk up to their desk anymore and see if they're working. So it does require an element of trust in leaders. So I just want to I wanted to go back to that because I think as leaders, we have to self-reflect and ask ourselves, what is a successful day? Maybe a successful day now is getting 3 or 4 quality hours of work out of your employee, and maybe 1 hour they go and they walk around their block or their neighborhood, or they go and they food shop for themselves and their neighbor. Maybe it's shutting down for 45 minutes and meditating and doing a yoga class. And I think leaders need to figure out, and I know this is easy to say, but not easy to do, but there needs to be an emphasis on wellness. And I think that needs to be incorporated in terms of how we define a successful day. To me, you want your people to be taking care of themselves. You don't want them burning out. You don't want them self-medicating. And by the way, alcohol sales is up 60%. So you don't want your employees feeling stressed to the max because of work amongst other things, and are not taking care of themselves. So wellness is a big piece to that. And when you talk about bottom line, and you talk about productivity, and you talk about retention and all those things that are important to a CFO and a business owner, I think wellness is going to be the secret piece to that.
Yes.
I think as we go on in time, I think we're going to see that. Yeah.
You know, that's so true. And it's funny, I think about how many of us, myself included, have been self-employed for a number of years. I mean, I started my practice in 2001. I started practicing in late fall of 98, and that got the admission technically in 1999. That's not important. The point is it's been doing this for a long time on my own. And what I recall sort of drove me away from working at law firms for about 2.5 years after law school, after I took the bar and started working, was just that micromanaging, right, style, and sort of the need to be controlling, and the focus on billable hours as opposed to quality. So
it's all, and you know, it comes from fear. I mean,
yes.
People overly control others because it comes from a place of fear, right?
Out of control. Mm-hmm.
Right. But it ends up having the opposite effect. You over control someone, you end up pushing them away.
So this is this might be some of the great advice.
Perfect example of that.
Sure,
right?
Sure. Right.
When independent because of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this might be some of the great advice you'd be giving, let's say, to your clients. Let's say they came to you and they said, Taryn, we're having some issues with work and morale. How do we boost employee morale? It's interesting. I was in a networking group not too long ago, and I heard someone bring up the issue of a problem they were having when they said they can't get their employees to work at 100% productivity like they were before the virus. And this was a long time ago. This was back in, I think, say early May, when things were still shut down and people had fewer outlets,
right.
Even outdoor restaurants. It was just, people were very much stuck in their homes. It was a much more strict time, and there were people still learning how to teach their kids online, online Zoom and teaching methods.
It was a chaotic time. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so, I think this person, had they been listening to you, would really redefine success. Maybe it's not getting their employees to work in the same pace they worked before the pandemic. And maybe that pace needs re-examining also.
Well, I almost challenge too, what do you consider 100% productivity? I mean, just because somebody's sitting at a desk for 8 hours doesn't mean they're churning out quality work for 8 hours. There's just so much a human being can do, right? And as someone in a position of leadership, they need to, and again, this kind of goes back to the empathy piece. Mm-hmm. It's unfair for us as leaders to expect even 100%, whatever that might look like. It's hard to even expect that being of what's going on right now. So, again, and that goes back to understanding each individual employee, each person has a different situation. I mean, how do you know that they're not, I know there are some families that, they're not going out into the supermarkets, and there's certain people that are designated to do all the shopping for the entire multiple families. So, and then we haven't even discussed about homeschooling and what, the disruption that's causing employees. So, there's many layers to this. And I think the good news is I don't think leaders need to be perfect. Nobody's expecting anyone to be perfect, but it's what you do when you have a misstep or when you make a mistake. And leaders make mistakes every day. What do you do when you make a mistake? What do you do when you should have handled something differently? Or maybe that conversation could have been said in a different way. And I think part of the answer to creating a solid culture is over communication.
I agree.
Not over communicate. When you under communicate, it leaves people assuming the worst. They create their own dialogue. They create their own fact sheet when they are missing critical information. So, I think another good quality of leadership, in addition to empathy, is transparent communication. This is, and share all the things that you're doing to keep that environment safe and keep people healthy, and share success stories and create focus groups. And, there's a lot you can do to keep morale up remotely. You just have to be creative and think outside the box. And for those leaders that have been leading for years, we might have to redefine what leadership looks like, which again goes back to that playbook that we're creating as we speak.
Right. It's unfolding each day.
It's
like
unfolding as we
employee handbook,
speak.
that's-
Right.
Exactly. And I find that so true. I find that the whole aspect of like leading with compassion, of also of creating focus groups, over communication. When I was on Jeremiah Fox's show in August as a guest, we talked about what legal advice I would give, let's say, to limit and reduce liability as an employer, right, during this pandemic, because you've got a whole different landscape, right? So you're the employer and you're listening to the show and you're acknowledging, okay, employees have stress, and we want to acknowledge that leaders have a lot of stress too. They have to comply with all the CDC guidelines around what's a safe environment. They have to respond differently to employees who may feel they need to quarantine. A lot of people ask me, can I test for COVID-19? Well, yes. They can test for, can I test for the antibodies? No. And they get so confused. So there's a lot to process. And so by encouraging people to communicate, right, to ask questions, to document, I think it does two things. One, it prevents the employee from filling in, right, the void with a negative story that maybe paints the employer in the most cynical and dark light.
Right.
And from your point of view, right, that might cause the employee to be fearful, to step back, to look for another job, to not be fully engaged. And from my point of view, I say that all those things might happen. And if the employee does need to be let go at some point, even if it's for a legitimate business reason, they're going to fill in the narrative they had. And if they take that narrative to different plaintiffs' employment lawyers, that's when I get a demand letter in the mail, and the employer is shocked, says, no, it had nothing to do with the person's fill in the blank, their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, But if you're not explaining in the dialogue what your concerns are, or if you're not addressing employees' concerns, and again, it could be concerns around, like, say their work is, suffering, right? How do you address that as an employer? I think that another thing to consider too is that I tell employers to document things. So, one scenario which we didn't cover, but I think maybe another show would be worth covering, is if an employee complains of an unsafe work environment, the last thing you want to do is get defensive and shut them down. And that has to do with the National Labor Relations Act, right? If you don't give that some credence, pay attention, listen, ask them to give examples, right? Have a dialogue, over communicate, Taryn, as you were saying.
But we must remember, though, that communication is a two-way street. It's not just leaders communicating to employees, but there needs to be a place where employees can express their concerns and grievances as well, right? So communication is a two-way street, Yeah.
So true. Just like right now, and listening to what you're saying there, exactly right. I think also that, from an employment law perspective, I look at it as if you can address an employee's concerns and show them that the workplace is in fact safe, if it truly is, then you might be deconstructing their future lawsuit if they say you had to let them go at some point and they said it was because you had an unsafe workplace. And if you could show, look, I showed them CDC documentation, right? I had them do a walkthrough. I encouraged them to come to the workplace and, had them talk to other employees. And these are not the immediate, right, go-to resolutions that, some of my clients are shocked when I tell them to do this. I say, write it down and ask them to specify. And they say, well, why would I do that? I don't want them to create a record. And I say, well, if there's something truly unsafe, you want to know about it. And if you're not defensive and you're not guarded and not trying to control everything, you will actually end up either resolving a truly unsafe situation. Oh, people aren't wearing their masks. I'll put out a memo about that. We'll have a meeting. Right. People are congregating too close to the water cooler. Well, we're going to deal with that. And so I think that really what I'm hearing from you is your method of, right, what are some of the techniques and methods that employers and managers can use? And a lot of it has to do with conversations, listening as much as talking, or even listening more than talking. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, you want to figure out how to motivate this person. You want to empower this person, and there's ways to get there, right? Coming down hard on people, resistance will be met with resistance. So you have to get creative and figure out how, because that's the goal, right? You want to empower them to do good work and to stay engaged and to stay committed, right? And that means having a human touch, these aren't robots, these are human beings, right? And we're all going through our own journey. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Very, very true. And Taryn, we're going to take a break, one more break. We'll come back. We'll have another 12 minutes or so to talk about some other thoughts about the workplace and how to really deal with, let's say, employees versus employee issues around, uncomfortability with others, how they're responding to the virus, whether they're not wearing their masks enough at work. We'll run through a scenario, and then I want to give you some space to tell the viewers how they can get in touch with you to get more of this amazing information, your website, your background, your telephone, whatever contact information you'd like to share with us. So we're going to take a break, folks. Again, I'm Eric Sarver. I'm here with Taryn Abrahams of Empowered Behavioral Services on the debut of my Talk Radio NYC show, Employment Law Today. We'll be right back.
Talking Alternative Radio, 24 hours a day.
Are you a curious person, always asking questions? Do you desire to be in the know? Then join me, Antonia, host of So Now You Know, Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc. Listen in as I attempt to satisfy that curiosity. I will be talking with amazing, everyday people. Join the fun. So Now You Know on Thursdays at 5 p.m. at talkradio.nyc.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
TalkingAlternative.com.
Okay, folks, we're back. I'm here again with Taryn Abrahams from Empowered Behavioral Services. Before we get into Taryn's information, how to contact her, I wanted to run us through another issue. And to me, the issues are very much interconnected, right? They sort of feed into each other, because if you can foster, if you being the manager, the business owner, the employer, if you can foster a safe and compliant, COVID-19 safe, compliant workplace, and you can encourage employees to practice safety measures like social distancing and wearing their mask and washing their hands and respecting people's space, then word gets out about that, and people tend to then feel more comfortable coming back to the workplace. And then you have to worry about the National Labor Relations Act, because you're not creating or the OSHA Act as well, the Occupational Safety Health Act, because you're not creating an unhealthy, unsafe work environment. So I guess my question, Taryn, for you is, let's say we have some business owners out there listening, and they've got employees coming into, and it could be an office, it could be a bar, a restaurant, it could be a shop, it could be any. I think that's an important point to make, right? That when you have employees back in the workplace, and really a lot of these rules apply across the board. Obviously, some places are more risky than others based on the volume of people you have coming through, the age of the people, etc. But what if you have, let's say, a business owner who is telling you, Taryn, I've got a lot of stress because I've got employees who they're outliers. They're not quite flat out breaking the rules, but the other employees are concerned because they tend to take their mask down to drink a coffee, they leave it down. They walk around the mask maybe like up to their lip.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is a huge pet peeve of mine. I can't tell you how much
It's a public issue. This is not just an employment issue. This is a public issue. Yeah.
Right. But, people say, or even just folks who are, they gather maybe too closely at work at the water cooler, and it makes others uncomfortable. People not respecting the 6 feet of distancing space. What might you tell an employer in terms of some methods? Maybe they've got the compassionate leadership, they're listening, they're how could they impart upon their employees the importance of following these rules? What might motivate an employee like that to follow these rules?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity for companies that maybe don't have a clearly defined culture to think about culture now. And I think it's a great opportunity to incorporate something in your mission statement or something in your wording around, caring for your fellow employee. And part of caring for each other is protecting each other and doing the right thing. And it's not a matter of you wanting to do it or not wanting to do it. It's doing it for the better of the organization. So I think it's an opportunity to embed some of those wishes in your mission statement or speaking to the culture that you want to create. And then I think you as an employer, you create clear guidelines. And then I really think that each manager, and this is a personal opinion, but I think this might be the answer to helping along these conversations, is I think training supervisors on how to de-escalate and address conflict is, I think, going to be a really important skill for leaders. How you approach that situation can ultimately determine the outcome. If you walk up to someone aggressively and say, come on, dude, put your mask on, I can guarantee you there's going to be an argument. So you have to be careful how you approach it. Now, if you have a rapport with that person and you want to use some humor, again, it's up to you and your comfort level. But if you're a leader and you see someone not following the guidelines, having a protocol in place on how to handle those things is important. And again, I think empathy is going to be a big component to that, because what's going to come out of that is why the person doesn't want to wear a mask and how they feel about what's going on. And politics might even come up. So you have to, as a leader, figure out how to dance around that, where you can still leave this person feeling validated, but yet still holding them accountable for following the guidelines that you've set in place. It is not easy to do that. I am the first one to say it is not easy to do. And especially if you're a leader who's afraid of getting COVID, it's really high likelihood that you're going to approach it from a reactivity standpoint. And we all know when you're reactive, that wall's going to go up and that person's not going to do what you ask them to do, right? So very challenging, but I think conflict resolution training is key. I also think training supervisors and leaders on the warning signs of depression and anxiety and how to de-escalate that is also part of that conversation. How employees deal with rules and guidelines, and it's so interesting to see people's perspective on the mask, because we've been here before with the seatbelt, and yet nobody complains about seatbelts. We all just wear our seatbelts. So, we are as a society trying to navigate through this, what has been some really big changes we had no time to prepare for.
Right.
So we have, we all are processing it in different ways, and leaders that are able to validate, acknowledge, de-escalate, support, I think are the ones that are going to see the best out of their employees. The ones that struggle with that may have a really tough time. You're gonna have a lot of sleepless nights, because again, you talk about people pivoting. I think leadership is in the middle of a very big pivot. And I think there's some really good that can come out of this. I know there's a lot of good that's going to come out of it, but I kind of picture like we've all been kind of punched in the face, And
repeatedly, right? It seems like Muhammad Ali, like it's
right, exactly.
It's not even single.
Exactly, and to add to that, and this is maybe a topic for another show. What do we do when our employees do come back and they're different people? They've been permanently changed from this experience. We need to start thinking about how to support those types of individuals as well. There is going to be a very big emphasis, I hope, on mental health. It's always been somewhat of a stigma in the workplace, but I think it's going to become a necessary part of the conversation on how to motivate and engage, keep people engaged.
I'll say one thing. I wanted to leave room and space for you to share your information, but what you're saying, what I hear, Taryn, it's so good to hear, because frankly, some of those techniques you discussed, de-escalation, right? Conflict resolution, trying to listen, and a lot of that is what we attorneys look for in mediations, right?
Right.
After
Yeah, it's true.
really, like, after the bottom fell out and people were engaged in litigation or potential lawsuits. So, to be able to do this before you get to that stage, wouldn't that be a win-win for the employer and the employee? And the last thing I'll say around this is, there's so much to say in another show. Mental health, that's a whole issue right there around
Yeah.
ADA, disability laws. But what I see too is that these tips we discussed today, these mindsets and methodologies, they're not reserved for just Google and the giant corporations. You can be a mom and pop shop and practice compassionate leadership. You can be a 5-person employer. You can be a 2-person employee shop, or you can have 4 offices and 100 employees. And everything that you're saying today goes a long way towards employee morale, towards reducing conflict, and everything in that regard. The less conflict and the less dispute and the less of a sort of coming to a head, the less chance of liability issues, less chance of lawsuits from an employment or negligence standpoint. So we've said a lot tonight. We covered a lot, and I want to give you the next minute just to share your information. If you have a slide you'd like to share. Yep.
Sure.
We'll do a screen share. There we go. So as I can see, you've got Taryn Abrahams.
Trying to share the actual slide. Here we are.
There we go. Okay. So once again, everyone,
Yes.
that was you just heard from.
For any companies that are looking for guidance, some insights, some consulting in terms of how to move leadership into a place where you can really engage people and keep people sane and connected, I would love to hear from you. If nothing else, please visit my website and you can subscribe to my free monthly newsletter, which I provide free tips and strategies on a variety of topics around leadership and company culture and business morale. And if you're feeling real bold, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at Taryn@ecbsllc.com.
Wonderful. Taryn, thank you so much. Once again, I'm Eric Sarver from the law office, Eric M. Sarver, an employment and business law firm practice. And this is the debut of my weekly show, Employment Law Today. Tune in next Tuesday, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Guests to be announced. Once again, Taryn, thank you for being on the show. It was really terrific and just a marvelous job. And I recommend Taryn highly if you're out there and you're struggling with these issues. That's the thing about our time into the hour. I want to thank you from my heart, sincerely. And everyone just stay put. We have a commercial break and then we'll be back.